If you grew up near the Appalachian Mountains, you already know. Folks don't just make up stories out here, they remember them. I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. It's wild how many of us are sitting in the dark, listening to the same story, scattered across different corners of the country. Hit the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find their way into these woods, whether they should or not. Let's start. I was 23 when I first stayed alone in the house on Briar Ridge. It wasn't mine, it belonged to my aunt, who'd inherited it from her parents and only used it in the summer when she wanted to get away from the chaos of her life in Charleston. The place sat at the very edge of Monongahela National Forest, tucked along an old logging road that hadn't seen regular use in decades. When she asked if I could watch over it for a weekend while she visited her sister in Kentucky, I said yes without hesitation. I had just graduated from college, was unemployed, and figured a few days in the mountains would give me space to think about what I wanted next. The drive up was a climb through winding switchbacks and long stretches of dense, moss-choked trees. My aunt's directions were written in pencil on an old recipe card. Follow the gravel until it turns to dirt, then keep going until the mailbox with the bent red flag. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun had dipped behind the ridge, and the forest had grown so shadowed it felt like the trees were leaning inward, blocking out more light than they should have. The house itself was simple, a two-story cabin with peeling paint and a sagging porch. What made it eerie wasn't the house, but the silence around it. No cars, no barking dogs, not even the buzz of cicadas I'd expected. My aunt once joked that Briar Ridge wasn't in the woods, but of them, like the forest had swallowed it whole and decided to keep it. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and dust. There was running water, electricity, and even a decent Wi-Fi signal, which surprised me considering how far we were from civilization. I unpacked my bag, claimed the couch in the den as my base camp, and raided the fridge stocked with soda cans and leftovers my aunt had left behind. At first, it felt like a retreat. I binged on junk food, streamed shows, and let the hush of the mountains wrap around me. But the silence became strange after a while. Not peaceful, hollow. Every creak in the walls, every pop of the wood stove, carried like a whisper in a cathedral. It was close to 11 when the first odd thing happened. My video froze. The Wi-Fi dropped, just like that. No buffering, no slowdown, just gone. I checked my phone, and the signal bar was dead. I fiddled with the router, unplugged it, restarted it. The lights blinked back to life, but there was still no connection. With no service inside the cabin, I stepped out onto the back deck, holding my phone above my head like a beacon. That's when I heard them. Two voices drifting from the dark beyond the tree line. Not shouting, not calling, talking. Conversational. The tone was enough to raise the hairs on my arms. One voice was sharp, female maybe, pitched too high to sound casual. The other was drawn out, male, as if every word was chewed before spoken. The sound was faint, but it wasn't echoing. It was close. I stood frozen on the deck, phone forgotten, listening. The words were indistinct, like I'd stepped into a dream where people talked without meaning. Then I flicked on the deck light. The voices stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so heavy it pressed against me. No insects, no wind, no leaves rustling. Just absence. I stepped backward into the house, shut the sliding door, and slid the deadbolt across. My aunt had warned me to always set the wooden bar she kept on the rail. Her mountain lock, she called it, so I did. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Hunters passing through. Campers arguing. The woods distort sound, but I still checked every door and window in the house twice before going back downstairs. I had just started to relax again when I heard it. A rattle at the deck door. One single shake of the handle, quick and decisive. I froze, gripping the armrest of the couch so tightly my fingers ached. Nothing followed. Minutes ticked by before I worked up the nerve to creep back upstairs. The door was locked, the bar still wedged in place. The deck light, however, had gone out. I didn't touch it. I sat awake on the couch, restless, alert to every sound. Around 1:30, I heard something unmistakable, the sliding door upstairs closing. It had a specific thud, a crooked fit that no other door in the house made. My stomach turned cold. I grabbed the only weapon I could find, a metal fireplace poker, and started up the stairs. My footsteps felt deafening on the old wood. When I reached the kitchen, the door was shut, the bars still braced across it, but on the linoleum I saw them. Footprints. Small. Barefoot. Wet. They led from the door into the kitchen, stopping a few feet from the table. I couldn't breathe. The prints looked fresh. The edges glistened. I turned, heart pounding, and that's when I saw her. A girl maybe 9 years old, standing in the hallway. White dress, hair tangled, skin so pale it looked gray in the weak light. Her arms hung loose at her sides, her face blank, expressionless. She stared through me like I wasn't a person at all. I tried to speak, but my throat closed. She blinked once, then turned and walked down the hallway. I followed, half against my will. When I turned the corner, the hall was empty. I opened every door, bedrooms, bathroom, even pulled down the attic hatch. Nothing. Silence again, pressing and absolute. When I returned to the kitchen, the footprints were gone. Not faded, not smudged. Gone. I pulled out my phone, thinking maybe I could at least document it. I recorded a video of the door, the floor, the time and date. Then I locked myself in my bedroom, shoved the desk against the door, and sat with the poker across my lap until dawn. When daylight finally broke, I staggered out, every muscle stiff. The kitchen floor was spotless. The door untouched. My phone showed no video in the gallery. Not corrupted, not deleted, just absent. By mid-morning, I was outside on the porch, bag packed, waiting for my aunt. I didn't tell her everything, only that I didn't sleep well, and that someone might have been on the property. She didn't look surprised. That night, I overheard her talking to my uncle on the phone. She said, "It's starting again. The ridge is restless." When I asked her the next morning what she meant, she only shook her head and nailed a length of wood across the basement window. "You're not the first to hear them," she said finally. "The mountain keeps what it wants. Sometimes it lets you see what it took." I had spent the last 4 years working as a traveling field technician for a rural power company. The kind of job that takes you into forgotten corners of Appalachia, where people still heat with wood stoves and pay in cash. My boss had given me an unexpected week off between contracts, and since I didn't have much tying me down, I figured I'd use it to do a favor for a friend. The friend was my old college roommate, Caleb. He and his fiancée had just closed on a place near the Cranberry Wilderness in eastern West Virginia, a rough patch of forest with more black bear than people. They were off to Myrtle Beach for a vacation, and he asked if I'd keep an eye on the cabin. His only instructions were simple: check the pipes, make sure the generator didn't act up, and feed their ancient beagle, Sadie. I didn't hesitate. I liked the thought of a quiet week away from phone calls and outage reports. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road that wound up past old strip mines, through abandoned homesteads, and finally into country so thick with hemlock that the sun only touched the road in patches. It wasn't a showy house, just cedar siding, tin roof, a sagging porch out front, but it was solid. The kind of place meant to last through winters when the snow stacked chest high. When I pulled in that first afternoon, the air was sharp with the smell of pine sap and wood smoke from some unseen neighbor miles away. No traffic, no voices, just the hiss of cicadas fading with the daylight. Caleb had left me a list of things in blocky handwriting on the fridge, along with 2 six-packs and a note that read, "Don't wander too deep. Folks say the ridge doesn't like to be crossed after dark." I laughed at it then, thinking it was just small-town color. I'd grown up around plenty of ghost stories and old-timers who swore the mountains had moods. You hear enough of that working service calls in hollers and logging camps. But something about the handwriting made me pause. It wasn't a joke. The first few nights passed easily enough. I kept a routine: coffee on the porch, walks with Sadie around the clearing, long stretches of reading by the propane lantern when the power blinked. The silence didn't bother me. It was a thick, quiet, layered, like you could almost hear the earth breathing under the trees. Things shifted on the 4th night. It was close to midnight. I'd stepped outside to smoke, leaning against the railing, watching the treeline sway faintly under the moon. At first, I couldn't put my finger on what was wrong. Then it hit me, the sound, or the lack of it. No insects, no whippoorwills, not even the creek down the ridge that usually babbled loud enough to carry. It was so still it hurt. That's when I caught it, movement between the trees, low to the ground. Not quick like a raccoon, not slinking like a coyote. slower, deliberate, as if it knew I was watching. The shape was wrong, longer, too smooth in the way it crawled. I froze with the cigarette half raised. Whatever it was didn't bolt. Instead, it eased backward, never breaking the angle of its head. Even from 30 feet away, I felt it fixed on me. I retreated inside, heart hammering, and latched the door. Only then did I notice what Caleb's cabin lacked: curtains on the big living room windows. Every light I'd left on spilled into the night like a beacon. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I tried to shake it off as my imagination. Still, I found myself walking out to the treeline with a hammer tucked in my belt. I told myself I was checking the propane tank, but my eyes kept darting to the ground. That's when I saw it, a mark in the dirt. It looked like a footprint, but stretched wrong. No boot tread. Bare. Toes long and bent, like fingers pressed into mud. It wasn't large, no bigger than a child's foot, but it was elongated, unnatural. I crouched over it, stomach tight, and realized the grass around the print was bent in a line, as if something had dragged itself forward. I didn't tell anyone. What could I say? I just went back inside and bolted the doors. That night, the woods made their presence known again. Around 2 in the morning, gravel crunched outside. Slow steps. Purposeful. My eyes shot open. Sadie, usually quick to bark at any rustle, stayed silent under the table. I muted the old DVD I'd left running and strained to listen. One step on the porch. A second. A third. Each with a pause in between, like whoever, or whatever, was climbing wanted me to notice. The screen door latch lifted. That unmistakable metallic click. It didn't open. The latch went up, then down. I crawled across the floor, poker from the fireplace clenched white-knuckled, and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty, but lying on the mat was a rock. I opened the door just enough to grab it. It was smooth, river-worn, perfectly round. On the underside, scratched deep into the surface, was a crude sunburst, circle center, for uneven rays stabbing out. My throat tightened. It wasn't a natural mark. I left it on the railing come morning, as if putting it back outside would keep whatever brought it from crossing the threshold. The next evening, the power died without warning. No storm. No trip breaker. Just a hard snap to black. I lit a couple candles I'd found in a drawer and sat in the kitchen, every sense straining. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping at the back door. Tap. 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 The back door was mostly glass. I killed the flashlight and crouched low. Slowly, I raised my eyes above the counter. At the edge of the treeline stood something short, maybe 4 feet tall, with limbs too thin to support its swollen head. Its arms hung low, nearly brushing the ground. It didn't move, but the tapping continued, steady against the glass, as if the sound didn't belong to the figure at all. I ducked back down, pulse slamming in my ears, and stayed hidden until the tapping ceased. A minute later, faint footsteps crossed the porch above me. Then silence. I didn't sleep. By dawn, the lights flickered back to life. No broken glass. No footprints. No sign of entry. Just a dull silence pressing in. I packed my bag and told myself I'd leave the next morning regardless. That night, exhaustion finally dragged me under. I must have slept for an hour before I woke to a sound that didn't belong. Breathing. Slow. Wet. Heavy. Not mine. It came from behind me. From the floor vent. I stayed absolutely still, every nerve on fire, listening as it drew out each inhale, each exhale, as if savoring the act of being inside the house with me. After what felt like a lifetime, the sound stopped. I waited until dawn, then grabbed my things, shoved them in the truck, and drove. I didn't stop until the mountains gave way to towns with gas stations and headlights. Weeks later, Caleb called. He laughed about my early departure until I told him about the rock. Then he went quiet. Finally, he said, "My granddad used to talk about something on that ridge. Called them the Sunken. Said they leave stones marked with a false sun. If you keep it, they'll come inside. If you throw it out, they just watch. Either way, they don't forget." He didn't laugh again. And when I hung up, I realized something that chilled me worse than that night ever did. I hadn't thrown the rock away. I'd tucked it in my duffel without thinking the morning I left. I was 29 when I agreed to look after my former professor's mountain home for a week. Her name was Dr. Morgan, a folklore scholar I'd studied under back in college, and she was one of the few people who had ever encouraged me to take writing seriously. She was flying out to Oregon for a conference, and when she learned I'd just left a copywriting job in Raleigh, she asked if I could watch the place, feed her hounds, and make sure the generator didn't sputter out. The house sat on the edge of the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina, perched against a slope where the road crumbled into dirt and finally dissolved into little more than a fire trail. The last mile felt like driving into another century. No cell service, no nearby houses, just dense trees that rose up like watchmen. Dr. Morgan's cabin wasn't rustic. It had running water, a big propane stove, and satellite TV that only worked when the weather didn't argue. But the bones of it were strange. Hallways that bent at odd angles, a long upstairs corridor that never quite filled with light, and the attic door in the ceiling of the foyer that I didn't notice until my third day, a square cut of wood with a rope dangling like a reminder. The dogs, Red and Jasper, were massive bloodhounds, sweet-tempered but stubborn. They spent most of the day stretched across the living room rug, snoring like drunkards, but when night came, they paced. They sniffed the door frames, ears twitching. It wasn't long before I started pacing with them. The first 2 nights were quiet. I read, made big pots of coffee, and tried to write a story or 2 of my own. The kind of silence that deep woods gave you was both suffocating and clarifying. I thought maybe the week would be good for me, a reset before I figured out what came next. But on the 3rd night, the dogs woke me. It was close to 3 in the morning when Red growled, so deeply the floor seemed to hum under me. Jasper joined in, their hackles rising as they faced the sliding glass doors that opened to the back deck. I sat up on the couch, throat dry. The floodlight snapped on for half a second, washing the trees in pale glow, before sputtering out. I fumbled with the switch. Dead. The dogs froze, staring into that black wall of trees. I tried to tell myself it was a raccoon, a deer, even a bear. But the way their bodies stiffened, the way their growls turned low and uneasy, it was like they were recognizing something they didn't have a word for. When daylight came, I searched the yard. Nothing. No broken branches. No footprints in the damp earth. The floodlight flicked back on when I tested it. Perfectly fine. That night, I locked every door twice, set the heavy fireplace poker across my lap, and told myself it was nothing. But then came the scratching. Not at the door. Not at the windows. Overhead. Slow, deliberate, like long nails dragging across old wood. The attic. The dogs went rigid, ears angled upward, bodies trembling in silence. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, that the house was settling. But I could hear it tracing the ceiling line, circling above me, step by step. By dawn, the sound was gone. I pulled the attic hatch open with shaking hands, climbed the ladder with a flashlight between my teeth. Dust. Boxes. An old trunk. Nothing disturbed. But the air smelled colder up there, as if the space had been breathing something other than the same stale insulation. The next day, I found the first pile of stones. 3 of them, stacked neatly by the threshold of the front porch. Perfectly balanced, the top one darker than the rest, as if it had just been pulled from the creek. I checked the security camera my professor had mounted by the door. Nothing but static between midnight and dawn. The motion sensor hadn't triggered. I knocked them over with my boot, half expecting something to rush out of the treeline. Nothing. Just silence too heavy for morning. On the 5th night, the floodlight stuttered again. This time it caught something before it went dark. Not a person. Not an animal. Something low, moving on all 4s, its limbs bent in ways that made my stomach lurch. It slid across the yard and into the trees without ever turning toward the cabin. I didn't sleep. Neither did the dogs. By the 6th night, I had stopped telling myself it was nerves. I unplugged the TV so the glass door wouldn't throw a reflection. Sat in the dark with the poker across my knees. At 4 in the morning, I heard steps. Not boots. Not bare feet. Something in between. But they weren't on the porch. They were beneath it. Boards creaked. Pairs of movements, like elbows and knees dragging across the beams. Then, directly under me, a whisper rose. "You dropped it." The voice was thin, rasping, neither man nor woman. My skin went cold. I hadn't realized until that moment that I had left the stones where they'd fallen after I kicked them over. I stayed frozen until sunrise. When I opened the door, another pile waited. This time 4 stones, one slick with something dark that smelled like rust and blood. I called Dr. Morgan, asked if she'd ever had strange things happen out there. There was a pause on the line, then a long sigh. "Don't step into those woods," she said. "That land belongs to the bound ones." "The what?" "They mark the doorways of people they notice. Stacks of stones. It means they've walked past your threshold. Don't disturb them." Before I could ask more, the line cut. That night was the worst. The dogs barked furiously at the glass. When I rushed over, I saw figures in the yard. Thin, pale, barefoot. At least 5 of them. But they weren't facing the cabin. They were turned toward the trees, bodies swaying faintly, arms hanging at their sides. The air felt charged, buzzing with a pressure that made my eyes water. One figure raised its hand and pointed toward the woods. Slowly, all the others followed, shuffling into the tree-line, dissolving into the dark without a sound. When dawn came, I found something hanging from the porch beam. A deer gutted clean, ribs pried open like hands, its eyes and tongue gone. Its legs were crossed neatly, like someone had laid it down as an offering. I didn't pack. I didn't clean. I shoved Red and Jasper into the truck, slammed the door, and drove until the forest thinned and the first gas station came into view. Dr. Morgan never mentioned it again. When I asked months later, her voice stayed flat. "They know you aren't from here," she said. "If you saw them once, they won't forget you." That night, back in Raleigh, I opened my closet to grab a jacket. On the floor, by my shoes, sat a stack of 3 stones. I moved into a borrowed cabin outside of Blackwater Hollow, a stretch of western Virginia most folks only pass through on their way to somewhere else. I'd taken a sabbatical from my job teaching high school history, half by choice and half because I was burning out. A colleague who owned the cabin offered it cheap if I'd agree to keep the pipes from freezing through the early winter. I thought it would be the perfect hideout to read, write, and sort myself out before deciding if I even wanted to go back to teaching. The cabin sat at the end of a rutted lane that clawed upward for a mile before flattening out on a ridge. From there, you could look out across endless folds of dark forest and see nothing else. No lights, no towns, no highway noise. My nearest neighbor was a farmer 3 miles away, and he only came up in spring to check his cattle. The rest of the time it was just me, the trees, and the sound of wind in the chimney. At first, the solitude was a relief. I stocked the pantry, kept a fire going, and read until my eyes watered. There was no cell signal up there, and the landline was dead more often than not, but that suited me fine. The first week passed quietly, long walks, cold mornings with my breath fogging the windows, the kind of silence that felt clean after years of cafeteria noise and hallway shouting. The strangeness began with a window. The kitchen window was always temperamental, stuck about 3 inches from the bottom where the track had warped. I'd shoved a wooden wedge into it to hold it closed, and since the screen was still intact, I didn't give it much thought, until one night around 2 in the morning. I'd woken thirsty, and went to pour a glass of water. The cabin was dark, but I didn't need lights. I already knew every inch of it. As I raised the glass, I heard it, a slow, drawn-out groan, wood pressing against wood. It came from the kitchen window. At first I thought it was the wind, but the air was still. Then it came again, pressure, release, pressure, like someone was testing the frame. I flicked the light on. The wedge was still in place, the screen unbroken, nothing moving outside but the tree shadows. After a minute of silence, I convinced myself it was the house settling and went back to bed. The next morning, I checked outside. The ground beneath the window was hard clay, no prints. But just to the left of the sill, the grass looked pressed down in a perfect oval, as if something had been standing there a long time. Not stomped, not trampled, just pressed. That was the day I nailed the window shut with 2 deck screws. 2 nights later, something stranger happened. Around 3:30, every digital device I had, laptop, old flip phone, the tiny router the previous tenant had left, blinked out. Dead. The power was still on. The lamps glowed, the refrigerator hummed, but anything electronic froze. Even the clock on the oven went black. Then the porch motion light snapped on. It only triggered if you passed through a specific slice of yard. I crept to the window and peeled back the curtain. The light stayed bright, flooding the grass. But nothing moved. The yard was empty. 30 seconds later, it clicked off. I stayed awake until dawn, the silence pressing in like a weight. By morning, all the electronics worked again as if nothing had happened. On the fourth night, it knocked. 3 sharp raps on the kitchen window, the same one I had nailed closed. I froze, plate in hand. The knocks weren't hesitant, they were impatient, demanding. I turned off the kitchen light and crouched behind the counter, heart rattling in my chest. 10 long minutes passed. No follow-up sound. When I finally risked peeking, I saw the screen was gone. Not torn, not bent. Just lifted clean out of the frame and set aside. On the outer pane of glass, smeared along the bottom edge, was something black and greasy like axle grease. For streaks, uneven as though a hand, or something like one, had pressed there. I left that night, drove down to a gas station on the main road, and sat under the fluorescent glow until sunrise. The next day, I called one of my former students, a boy named Lewis who had stayed in touch after graduation. He still lived nearby and had hunted those woods since he was a kid. I told him everything. No edits. He showed up that afternoon with a duffel full of trail cameras and a rifle slung over his shoulder. He didn't laugh. He didn't call me crazy. He just said, "If it's what I think, we'll catch it." We set up 4 cameras around the cabin, all night vision, motion activated. Lewis offered to stay. I didn't argue. That night, we sat up with coffee, the rifle across his knees, listening more than we spoke. Around 4 a.m., one of the cameras pinged. The feed showed the back of the cabin, right beneath the kitchen window. At first, nothing, just grass stirring. Then something slid into view. Not walking, sliding. It was low, almost crawling, but too smooth, too fluid. The body seemed long, pale in the infrared, elbows jutting, knees bent in reverse. It glided until it reached the siding. The next frame showed it upright. It had the outline of a person, but it wasn't right. Too thin, the limbs too long, the head tilted as though the neck couldn't bear the weight. One arm stretched forward, pressing against the glass. The feed glitched. When it came back, the yard was empty. Lewis didn't say a word. He sat down by the front door with the rifle and waited until morning. When we checked the camera again, the memory card was corrupted. Every file except that one moment was wiped. 2 days later, the kitchen screen was back in place. Crooked, bent, jammed into the frame as if someone, or something, had tried to put it back without knowing how. For faint smudges remained on the glass. Fingerprints, maybe, but stretched too far apart. Lewis told me not to stay. He said his grandfather had warned him once about things the old folks called the pale kin, shapes that wandered the ridges after Samhain, when the last leaves fell. According to him, they weren't ghosts or animals but borrowers, things that took places and faces but never quite fit them. They knock to see who answers, he said. If you answer, they come in. If you don't, they keep knocking. I broke my lease by the end of the week. Left furniture, dishes, half my books. I didn't care. I moved into a 1-bedroom closer to town, thin walls, constant traffic, people yelling outside at all hours. It was the most comforting noise I'd ever heard. But sometimes late at night, when everything goes quiet, I still think I hear it. 3 knocks. Sharp, fast, deliberate, like something patient, still testing the frame. I was 27 when I agreed to watch my aunt's property up in Buchanan County, Virginia, near the edge of Jefferson National Forest. I'd just quit working construction in Roanoke after a job site accident that left me with too much time and too many thoughts, and she offered me a small stipend to stay in her cabin while she visited family down in Florida. The deal was simple: feed her dogs, keep an eye on the generator, and water the greenhouse if the weather stayed dry. It sounded like a good way to clear my head. A week alone in the woods, no coworkers breathing down my neck, no city noise. I figured I'd read, sleep, maybe even start sketching again. The cabin was older than I expected when I pulled up. Timber beams, a sloping porch, tucked into a clearing with ridges rising on every side. The driveway was gravel, but beyond that was nothing but trees. No towers, no bars of service, no neighbors within earshot. Just me and the hounds, 2 big setters named Copper and Bramble. The first few days went by slow, in the way I needed. I brewed coffee, sat on the porch with the dogs at my feet, and tried not to think about the wreck that had ended my job. At night, I cooked simple meals, watched old DVDs my aunt kept on a shelf, and fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the soft hum of the generator. The woods felt heavy but not hostile, at least not at first. On the third night, the dogs woke me. It was nearly 2 in the morning when Copper growled low enough that the floor vibrated. Bramble was already standing at the sliding glass door in the kitchen, body rigid, ears pinned back. I grabbed a flashlight and crept over, half expecting a bear nosing through the compost bin. But the floodlight on the porch blinked once, then snapped off. Dead. The dogs didn't bark, they just stared, their bodies trembling in silence. I switched the flashlight on and swept the yard. Nothing. Not a branch stirring, not a deer in sight. Just stillness that felt like it had weight. I told myself it was nothing, but I double-locked every door before going back to bed. The next morning, I noticed something odd. Just under the kitchen window, the grass was pressed flat in a perfect oval. Not trampled, not muddy, just gently bent, as though someone had stood there for a long time without moving. That was the first time I felt something watching. The following night, I heard humming. Not music, not a tune, just a broken, off-key sound. The way someone might hum when they didn't know the melody, but wanted to fill silence anyway. It came from the kitchen window, soft but deliberate. I froze in bed, listening. The hum rose and fell in uneven waves, always stopping right when I thought I might get up to check. Eventually, I crept down the hallway without turning on lights. The sound cut off the moment I reached the sink. I braced myself, pulled the curtain back an inch. Something stood at the treeline. Tall, too still. Its outline was just visible in the faint glow of the moon, but it didn't move toward me. Instead, it turned sideways and drifted between the trees, slow and smooth. And as it moved, the humming started again, fading into the dark. I sat in the living room the rest of the night with the dogs pressed against my legs, the rifle I'd brought from home balanced across my lap. At dawn, I went out to the spot by the kitchen. In the soft dirt, I found prints. Not shoes, not boots. Bare feet, but stretched long, the toes splayed unnaturally wide, like hands pressed into the earth. They circled the cabin and vanished behind the shed. That was when I considered leaving. But stubbornness, or maybe shame, kept me. I told myself it was just some drifter messing with me, maybe kids from the next county over. Still, that day I sharpened the axe by the porch, checked the locks twice, and kept the rifle closer. The fifth night was worse. I woke at 1:30 to silence so deep it made my ears ring. The generator still hummed, but the lights had gone out. Every bulb, every lamp, even the electric fence my aunt used for the garden, all dead at once. The fridge stayed on, which somehow made it worse. Then came the knocking. 3 raps. A pause. 3 more. It moved around the cabin, east wall, west wall, the back near the kitchen. Always in threes. Always steady. The dogs hid under the bed, whimpering. I crouched in the hallway, rifle raised, waiting for glass to break or a door to give. But nothing came. When the sun rose, I found a spiral behind the shed. Bones. Clean, pale deer bones arranged in a circle 3 feet across. Too neat, too deliberate. We hadn't hunted on that property in years. Someone brought them. That day I called my father. He grew up in these hills, and I thought maybe he'd laugh it off or tell me it was just kids playing tricks. Instead, he went quiet. "You're near the hollow folk," he said finally. "Don't answer if they talk. Don't follow if they call. They don't come to be seen." I wanted to press him, but he hung up. That night, the doorknob turned. Slowly. Testing. The dogs whimpered under the bed. I sat frozen in the hallway, rifle leveled at the door. The knob twisted halfway, then stopped. And then a voice spoke through the wood. "Don't mind me." Calm. Friendly. Like a neighbor passing on the road. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. A second later, something pressed against the window. A face. Pale. Hairless. Eyes too wide, lips cracked and split into a grin that stretched wrong. It stared in at me until I shouted and raised the rifle. The face vanished instantly. The next morning, every chicken coop door was open. The hens were still there, but each one had a small, perfect triangular cut in the feathers near its breast. Not deep, not bloody. Just marked. When my aunt returned, I told her everything. She listened quietly, then nodded like she already knew. That night, she stayed up with me, shotgun across her knees. Nothing happened. But 2 nights later, when I was back in my own apartment in Roanoke, I woke at 2 a.m. to a sound at my window. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. I was 31 when I moved into the Ridge house outside Laurel Fork, Virginia. It didn't belong to me. It was owned by a man I'd worked for on and off since I was a teenager. A contractor named Harlan, who everyone in the county seemed to owe a favor to. When he died without family, the place went through probate limbo, and nobody wanted to take it on. It sat empty for nearly a year before the bank locked it up. I had just finished a nasty divorce and needed somewhere cheap to stay. So when one of Harlan's old crew told me the bank would lease it short-term while they figured out what to do, I signed the paperwork without thinking twice. The Ridge house was built crooked and proud on land that had been logged and forgotten. No close neighbors. No cell service after a certain bend in the road. You could see for miles down into the valley, but the trees pressed in thick on every side of the house like they were trying to swallow it. It had been patched together over decades, hand-milled beams, a tin roof that buckled in storms, wiring that clicked when you plugged in too much. The kind of place where nothing quite lined up, but everything felt like it had a stubborn reason for being. At first, I liked the solitude. I worked carpentry jobs when I could, but the winter season had slowed down. My evenings were quiet. Coffee on the porch, old westerns playing on a second-hand DVD player, a notebook where I wrote down half-formed thoughts. The stillness wasn't peaceful exactly, but it suited me. That lasted about a week. The first thing I noticed was gravel shifting outside one night. I had been reading in the loft bedroom when I heard the crunch of steps moving slowly up the drive. Not scurrying animal steps, steady, deliberate, each one spaced like a person walking. I set the book aside, held my breath, listening as the sound stopped right at the porch. Nothing else followed. I grabbed a flashlight, opened the door, and shone the beam across the yard. Empty. No deer, no figure. But the air carried that sharp, skin-prickling sense of being watched. The following night, tapping began. 3 knocks in sequence on the window nearest my bed. Then silence. A minute later, the same rhythm repeated on the living room glass. Then again at the kitchen, always circling, always steady. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. It went on long enough that I snapped and shouted, "I hear you. Who's there?" The tapping ceased. The woods outside pressed silent and unblinking. I told myself it was some local kids having fun, except Laurel Fork wasn't a town full of kids. Most folks I'd seen were old-timers who moved slow and didn't waste energy on pranks. That excuse barely held water, but I clung to it. 2 days later, while splitting firewood, I caught movement along the tree line. A figure leaned out from behind a poplar, half-shadowed. Watching. I wiped sweat from my brow and shouted, "Need something?" No answer. The shape slid back behind the tree and didn't reappear. The sheriff's deputy was a woman named Green, younger than me, but with eyes that looked like they'd seen plenty. I told her about the tapping and the figure. She nodded but didn't smile. Said maybe a squatter, maybe some drug runners hiding out in the woods. "Keep your doors locked," she told me. "Don't go looking for it." That night, something slammed the outer wall so hard it rattled a shelf loose and sent a cup clattering to the floor. I stormed outside with the rifle I kept by the door. My flashlight beam swung across the siding and froze. A bird was nailed to the wall. A crow, wings spread, its body sagging from the nail through its chest. Eyes gone, tongue missing. Blood still wet. I gagged, yanked it down, buried it in the garden. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The following evening I wired up every motion light I owned and set them to chime inside if anything passed. I rigged notches in the porch railing so I could set the rifle without fumbling. I convinced myself preparation would keep me safe. 3 nights later, I came home late from a run into town. My headlights swept the yard and caught something upright among the tomatoes, a scarecrow. Except I hadn't built one. It wore a plaid shirt and jeans stuffed with straw. The head was a burlap sack with empty eye holes burned through. It stood crooked, waiting. I grabbed a can of kerosene from the shed, doused it, and lit it without hesitation. Watched it collapse into flames, sparks drifting into the dark. I thought that would end it. It didn't. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to creaks downstairs. Heavy steps pacing slowly across the boards. I lit the lantern, rifle in hand, peered over the loft railing. Nothing moved, but the air was dense, as if someone had been standing there waiting for me to stir. I whispered, "Who's there?" My voice wavered. No answer. When I finally descended, the front door stood wide open. The next morning, I found tracks in the mud. Barefoot, 5 toes, but stretched wrong. Too long, as though fingers had been pressed into earth instead of feet. I drove into town to show Deputy Green the photos. But she wasn't there. Another deputy told me she'd gone missing 2 days earlier, last seen driving up toward the ridge. That was when I knew I had to leave. But fear rooted me. I told myself I'd make it one more night, then pack. As dusk fell, I noticed smoke curling from the chimney. I hadn't lit a fire. Heart hammering, I killed the truck engine and crept around back. Through the kitchen window, I saw someone sitting in the living room, wearing Harlan's old work coat, the one I had sealed in a chest in the attic when I moved in. I didn't go inside. I backed away, got in the truck, and drove to a motel 30 miles off. 2 days later, I returned with state police. The house was empty, cold. No fire, no coat, no signs of forced entry. But on the kitchen table sat something that hadn't been there before. A string of small bones, woven into a circle, tied with a strip of burlap. I didn't step fully inside. I dropped the keys on the counter, walked out, and left the place behind. Locals call them the Ashmouths. Folks say they're not ghosts, not animals, not people, just remnants of something that lived here before. They come when houses stand too empty, when land is left untended. They mimic voices, wear old clothes, move into spaces where they don't belong. And sometimes they stay. I rent a second-floor apartment now, above a pawn shop in town, concrete and neon humming below. But on the nights when the air goes still, I swear I hear it again. Tap, 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 always 3 times, always moving from one wall to another. I agreed to spend a long weekend at my cousin's place on the edge of the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky. He'd just gotten married, and his wife was dragging him to some family reunion in Nashville. He knew I'd been looking for quiet. My work as a substitute teacher in Lexington had been a treadmill of rowdy kids, endless lesson plans, and fluorescent headaches. So when he offered me his house for 3 nights, I said yes. The property was tucked up in a hollow with one road in, and no neighbors close enough to see through the trees. You could miss the turn entirely if you didn't know the spot. 2 leaning sycamores that looked identical to every other tree, then a gravel climb that felt longer than it should. His house was small, wooden, and crooked in the way that cabins pieced together over generations always are. I told myself it would be perfect. I'd grade papers, maybe get a little writing done, and sleep without sirens or car horns. The first day was exactly that. I fed his chickens, threw a ball for his dog, reheated leftovers, and sat out on the porch with a notebook. The woods pressed close, heavy with oak and pine, but I grew up around places like this and didn't think much of it. The first oddness came the second night. It was close to 1 when I woke to a sound I couldn't place. Not coyotes yipping, not the low hum of insects. This was sharper, a click like a latch being tested. I held my breath. A second later, it came again. The unmistakable sound of a doorknob turning slowly. I crept from bed, grabbed the baseball bat my cousin kept propped in the hallway, and stood still listening. No footsteps, no shuffle, just silence pressing in. After what felt like forever, I eased the door open and scanned the dark. Nothing moved, but then I heard another sound, the faint slide of a drawer opening. Then another, slow, careful, as though someone was sifting through utensils, not stealing, just checking. That was worse than noise. That patience, that quiet searching. I ducked into the bathroom, locked the door, and tried to get a bar of signal on my phone by holding it toward the small, warped window. Nothing. I typed a text to a friend anyway, thumb shaking as I wrote, "Call police, house not safe." It sat unsent, with the spinning circle mocking me. Outside the door, the house had gone still. I climbed into the tub and shoved at the window, groaning in its frame. It squealed half open. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would give me away. Then the stairs creaked. 1 slow step. Another. Paused. Another. The bathroom was right at the landing. I stared at the crack under the door. A shadow pooled there, faint but certain. It didn't move like a person's shadow. It held. Then there came a sound, short, fast sniffs. Like something was smelling me through the crack. And then it spoke. You turned off the porch light. The voice was flat, neither male nor female. Not angry, just stating. 3 knocks followed. Even, measured, not loud but final. I sat frozen, bat raised, waiting for the door to rattle. But after a long stretch, the shadow drew back. The weight of its presence retreated down the stairs. I waited 5 minutes by the count in my head before I forced the window wider, scraping my arms raw as I shoved myself through and dropped into the brush outside. I ran barefoot through the woods. Branches tore my skin, rocks bit into my heels, but I didn't stop until I saw a faint porch light glowing through the trees. I stumbled into the yard of a trailer with peeling paint and an old flag drooping from the post. I pounded on the door until a man in boxers opened, confused and blinking. "There's someone in my house," I stammered. He handed me a phone without asking questions. The sheriff's department sent a car. When they checked, no one was inside. No broken windows. No forced entry. But every single drawer in the kitchen was open. The only thing missing was one knob, unscrewed from a drawer face and taken. I told myself I'd imagine the voice, the shadow, the knocks. But I never stayed another night alone in that house. Months later, I was back in Lexington when I overheard an old man at a diner telling a story. He was talking about the lantern men, shapes that moved from house to house, testing doors, sniffing through cracks, speaking back what they'd seen you do. They never stole money, never broke in. They only took something small, something ordinary, so you'd know they'd been there. "They don't come to hurt you," the man said. "They come to remind you the house isn't yours. You're just borrowing it." I didn't join the conversation. But that night, in my apartment, I woke at 2:11 a.m. to 3 slow knocks on my kitchen window. The drawer under the sink was wide open, and one knob was missing. I was 24 the spring I agreed to spend a week at my grandmother's old cabin in Leslie County, Kentucky. She'd passed 2 years earlier, and the place had just been sitting there, half forgotten, at the edge of the Redbird district of the Daniel Boone Forest. My mom said it needed cleaning before we decided whether to sell it. I was between jobs and drifting after a messy breakup, so a week in the woods seemed like a way to clear my head and maybe do something useful. The drive out there already felt like going back in time. Asphalt turned to cracked gravel, then to dirt tracks barely wide enough for my hatchback. When the trees finally swallowed the sky and the road ended in a tangle of brush, I saw it, a squat, faded cabin crouching against the ridge. The siding was weather-beaten gray, and the roof slanted like it had been tugged downward by years of snow. The porch sagged under its own weight. It wasn't cozy, it wasn't even inviting, but it was family land, and that was reason enough. The first 2 days went by without much to notice. I swept up mouse droppings, patched screens, dragged busted furniture into the yard. At night, I ate microwave leftovers Mom had packed in a cooler and tried reading by lamplight. It was lonely but tolerable. The forest at night was deep and still, the kind of silence you can't explain until you've heard it, like the world has pressed pause. The third evening, things started shifting. I was brushing my teeth in the tiny bathroom when I heard a sound from the back of the house. Just one knock at first. Soft, like someone testing the wood. I froze with the toothbrush halfway to my mouth. Then another knock, heavier. I crept into the kitchen, careful not to let the floorboards groan. The back door had a small pane of glass. I stood there staring into the dark, expecting to see a branch swinging loose. Nothing. The lock was still bolted. I killed the light and sat in the living room with my pulse hammering. No more knocks came, but I hardly slept. The next morning, the boards of the back porch were striped with prints. Barefoot. Not mine. I hadn't gone outside without shoes. These were wide, flat, the toes long and oddly spaced. They went up and down the steps in a looping trail, then disappeared into the wet grass. I tried to tell myself it was nothing I could explain. An animal. A trick of damp wood. But the denial sat heavy and false. That night, I barricaded the back door with a chair and laid a hammer on the floor beside my mattress. Around 3 in the morning, a tapping sound woke me. It came from the living room window. Gentle, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I crawled to the hallway and peeked around the corner. The window was cracked an inch, where I'd propped it open earlier to let air in. Thin fingers were pressed against the glass. Long, pale, twitching in strange little motions, nails crusted dark like they'd been digging in soil. Tap, tap, tap. I surged forward, slammed the window down hard. The hand snapped away instantly. I shoved the lock, pulled a blanket over the whole frame, and sat shaking with the hammer clutched in my fist. At dawn, greasy smudges smeared the glass. One faint partial print, too long, too stretched, lingered like proof. On the fourth night, the sounds changed. Around 1 in the morning, slow steps clomped across the roof, measured heavy, from the living room, across the kitchen, then straight above me. They paused there. My heart rattled. Then came the impact. Something slammed into the side of the cabin with bone-rattling force. Once, twice, over and over like a body hurling itself against the walls. The lamps shivered. After that came whispering, low, rasping, broken, like someone speaking through teeth clenched tight. It circled the house, moving from the bedroom side to the back door, then right up against the front. I crawled into the bathroom, locked the door, and sat in the tub with the hammer balanced across my knees. The whispering went on, rising and falling, until it thinned and vanished. By morning, my nerves were shredded. I called my dad from the landline. He didn't ask questions, just said, "Stay put. I'll be there tomorrow." That afternoon, I forced myself to step outside. Behind the woodshed, I found a spiral laid in the dirt, deer bones, sun-bleached and carefully arranged. The circle was tight and deliberate, each rib angled inward. We hadn't hunted here in years. Someone or something had carried those bones. I should have left right then, but fear and stubbornness kept me rooted. I told myself I could last one more night until Dad came. The cabin went still after dark. Too still. At exactly 10:41 the next morning, when I was half dozing on the couch with the hammer still in hand, there was a knock at the front door. 3 knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. I stood, throat dry, and looked through the peephole. No one stood on the porch. But the knocking didn't stop. It echoed steady against the door as my father's truck came crunching up the drive. Relief nearly dropped me to my knees. I yanked the door open and bolted straight into the yard. He didn't ask why I ran. We just got in the truck and drove. We never filed a report. Never told anyone what I'd heard or seen. Months later, when talk came up of selling the cabin, I overheard a man in town muttering to my father. He said, "That ridge has always been Lantern Hollow. They don't knock to come in. They knock so you'll open. That's the difference." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. But sometimes, in the quiet hours around 2 or 3 in the morning, even here in the city, I wake to a sound that makes my skin prickle. Tap, tap, tap. Always 3 times. Always waiting. I was 29 when I agreed to move into my grandfather's cabin on Brush Mountain in Pulaski County, Virginia. My family had avoided the place for years after he died. No one wanted to claim it, though nobody would say why. My mother framed it as practical. The land tax had to be paid, the place had to be looked after, and I was between jobs after leaving a mechanic's shop in Roanoke. A free roof, she said, until I figured things out. She didn't tell me the full story until after I'd already brought my duffel bag inside. I called her to say I'd made it. She went quiet on the phone, then muttered, "Your grandfather stopped using the upstairs bedroom the year before he passed. Said the walls listened when he slept up there." I laughed nervously, waiting for her to tell me she was joking. She didn't. The cabin sat deep off a gravel track, the kind you'd never find unless someone led you. Hemlock and oak pressed close enough to block most of the light, so even at noon the clearing looked like dusk. The porch leaned downhill, the wood soft in spots, and one shutter hung loose by a nail. Inside smelled of dust, dry wood, and something faintly metallic like rust. The first night passed without trouble. I unpacked a little, heated a can of stew on the propane stove, and tried to ignore the stuffed turkey mounted above the mantel, its glass eyes staring sideways. The silence was oppressive but not unfamiliar. I'd grown up in rural Virginia and knew the way the forest could drown out everything except its own heartbeat. On the second night, I woke to slow, deliberate steps across the porch. I lay frozen in bed, counting them. Heel toe. Heel toe. They stopped at the front door. No knock. No retreat. Just a stillness that filled the air like pressure. At dawn I checked. The porch dust looked undisturbed, no prints. Still, the weight of those steps clung to me. The third day, I drove down to the gas station at Draper Valley. When I mentioned the cabin on Brush Mountain, the clerk paused halfway through bagging my coffee. He looked at me like I'd said something vulgar. "Ain't many last long up there," he muttered. Then quieter. "Don't stand in the windows after dark." That night, I couldn't help myself. I left the lights off, sat in the living room, and listened. Around 2:30, the boards creaked again. Footsteps traced across the porch. Something scraped, like metal dragged against wood. Then a slow, heavy pull, as though claws or nails dragged across the boards. I stayed still, every muscle aching from holding so tense. Eventually, silence returned. But in the morning, I found something by the woodpile, a ring of bones. Small ones, bird maybe, arranged perfectly, tips pointing inward. I shoveled them up and threw them into the trees. When I called my mother later, I only said I'd been hearing things at night. She grew quiet, then finally said, "Your grandfather told me once the mountain doesn't like to be empty. Said things walk when a house goes too long without voices inside." She changed the subject right after. The next night, I dragged the couch in front of my bedroom door and kept a crowbar close. Around 3 a.m., I heard shuffling on the porch again. Then 3 slow knocks at the wall, exactly at 3:12. When I stepped out at dawn, a length of twine hung from the porch beam, tied with feathers and knuckle bones, swaying gently in the breeze. By then, leaving seemed logical. I even packed a bag, but when I tried the truck, it wouldn't turn over. Not even a click. The battery looked fine. Inside, my phone was dead too, plugged in but refusing to charge. That was when I heard my mother's voice. "Eli, come out here. Help me carry these groceries." It came from the tree line, lilting, warm, exactly the way she used to sound when I was a boy. I froze. Then again closer. "Eli, I made dinner." The second time, the voice rasped on the edges like something had practiced the cadence, but not the life behind it. I hammered boards over the windows and dragged the bookcase against the back door. Sat in the hallway with the crowbar ready, my breath shallow. At 1:48, the roof creaked. Footsteps paced steadily from front to back, then claws scraped across the shingles, long and deliberate. Something circled the house, dragging nails across the walls, breathing against the doors. And always the voice, switching sides, coaxing, "Eli, it's me. Open up. You don't want me waiting." The cellar door banged twice, shaking the floor. Then quiet. At dawn, the porch was bare except for a new arrangement of bones on the boards, this time spelling one word: stay. I didn't argue. I grabbed my bag, tried the truck again, and the engine roared to life on the first turn. I drove down the gravel track faster than I should have, refusing to check the rearview mirror. But I swear as I rounded the last bend, I caught a glimpse of the cabin in the mirror. The front door stood wide open, and on the porch, the stuffed turkey that had hung over the mantel now sat propped in the chair, staring toward the road.